Thank you, James. That was a very long introduction, but thank you for your generosity. I don't need one. But I know, as you know, I've been writing on partition for a long, long time. But I thought I'd begin personally and say to you that my first introduction to partition was through literature. I grew up in a home where the figure of Saadat Hasan Manto, the famous Urdu short story writer, was larger than life. He's my granduncle. I grew up with his daughters, my cousins. And so, I mean, one of the sort of things that I knew before I knew anything else was how to say "Apar de gurgurdi anks of the bitahana di mungi dal of the lantan," which is Toba Singh. So I think I knew that before I could say the kalma, maybe. But I was very young, and my brothers and who were all older to me, they would talk about it. So, I wondered, and I heard about partition. There was evidence of material culture of partition. For instance, the house we lived in belonged to Hindus. We lived in something called Lakshmi Mansions. My father and my family would live upstairs, and Manto's family was downstairs. And there was this stone table that could not move with the Hindu family that left. And so that was a very sort of important presence of the past in our present, the persistence of that. So I actually started, when I started thinking about partition, I was really curious whether Manto's stories were just fiction or whether they were corroborated by the evidence that one could find. So while Manto was interested, Manto sort of wrote about the human tragedy of partition, i.e. the consequences of partition, I was interested in establishing the causes of partition. And so, yes, I mean, my first book, The Sole Spokesman, Jinnah, the Muslim League and the Demand for Pakistan, basically asked the question of why India was partitioned. And that was really a political question. And so I couldn't really access that answer by looking at human tragedy. So I think that so the questions we ask, determine how we proceed. But I did, after several years, after doing this work, did return to produce this book, The Pity of Partition, on Manto, returning to literature. So it was in many ways coming full circle from where I began with Manto. And so I just extracted a few things to share with you today, because I do think that literature and history juxtaposed together can give us a much fuller picture of what really transpired. There's high politics, and then there's the question of the human dimension, the tragedy that was partition. So let me just use a few of those. Whose blood is being shed with such heartlessness every day? Saadat Hasan Manto rude as he tried making sense of Independence Day celebrations in Bombay on August 14th, 1947. Pakistan and India had been declared separate countries. There was public rejoicing, cries of Hindustan Zindabad, Pakistan Zindabad, but they struck a discordant note with the frenzy of murder, rape, and arson that were being perpetrated in the name of religion. Confused and disoriented, Manto could not decide whether India or Pakistan were his homeland. Where would they burn or bury the bones from which the vultures had stripped off the flesh of religion, he asked. And now that we are free of servitude, what would the people of the subcontinent dream of now? Would they have their own slaves now? To each of these big questions, there was an Indian answer, a Pakistani answer, and a British answer. And I would today add that there is also a Bangladeshi answer today. The Batwara, or partition. Batwara is so much of it's literally division, but is used frequently in land demarcations. So the Batwara, this is how Manto referred to partition. It may have divided lives and drawn lines of blood in the hearts and minds of people, but the arbitrary lines drawn by the British on the map were not visible to anyone's eye. Some things could never be divided, he noted, like the common literary heritage. And Aftab very eloquently just talked about the common heritage of Bengal in Tagore and Qazi Nazrul Islam, and much more. I mean, how can you divide literary heritage? And not to mention bonds of friendship, which sort of prevail over religious and political divisions. The pity of partition, as Manto emphasized, was not that instead of one country, there were now two, independent India and independent Pakistan, but that human beings in both countries were slaves, slaves of bigotry, slaves of religious passions, slaves of animal instincts and barbarity. That was the real pity of partition. And that is the real pity of partition. Baffled by the furies let loose by the advent of a much wanted freedom, Manto left Bombay in January of 1948 for Lahore with more questions than answers. Should we wash our hands of humanity? Have we lost faith in that thing called conscience? He wondered. Partition's unpardonable horrors were a blot on the face of humanity. The fanfare of official nationalisms covered up the tragedy of partition, with the result that human bestiality was finding perfect ground for nurture to become ever more audacious in its expression. There were people who had committed murder and were deemed to be, quote unquote, heroes of their community rather than condemned. This is what was going on. Not a day passed, he noted, without a human being being killed by a fellow human being. Why are these few individuals so murderous? And why are their hearts and minds so possessed by murder and violence, he wondered. The fundamental questions that Manto asked through his writings, both fictional and non-fictional, about the nature of the post-colonial transition continue to resonate with us, something that Aftab again has outlined very beautifully with the legal aspect. I would throw in just about everything else, Aftab, take the police as well. I mean, just about the idioms have outlasted partition. So, the fundamental questions that he asked, I think, continue to be relevant today as we try, I think, rather unsuccessfully to negotiate the ghost of partition in the 21st century. Weren't the basic problems confronting Indians, Pakistanis, or for that matter, Bangladeshis the same? Was Urdu going to become extinct in India? And what form would it take in Pakistan? Would Pakistan become a religious theocratic state? Would loyalty to the state confer citizens the right to criticize the government? The paradox of freedom, or the multiple paradoxes of freedom that Manto was pointing to, his discerning literary gaze was pointing to, has mutated over the past 7.5 decades into bewildering permutations and combinations. Partition may have become a distant memory for many, and its invocations and public discourse limited to scoring points on the grid of patriotism. But its absent presences, this is what I really wanted to emphasize, in everyday life across the Great Divide of 1947, are indicators of its historical significance, not merely as an event that occurred 75 years ago, but a process that is very much part of our present. It's an ongoing process. As we speak, partitions are happening in our minds and in our hearts. It's an ongoing process with neither end nor beginning. Partition structures the entire post-colonial South Asian experience. How? It's an institutionalized form of dividing and disconnecting. Partition has been the founding myth of post-colonial nation states in South Asia. It ferrets out people, communities, and linguistic cultures that were once historically indivisible. If there are multiple slippages, elisions, and contestations and narratives about the Great Divide in official discourse, something that occurred 75 years ago, there are extraordinarily strange, awkward silences about its constant reenactments in the post-colonial nation states of South Asia. What do I mean? I'm referring to that ghost of partition that continues to haunt over Indian Muslims in India. The fact that on a constant basis, it's not that you are dividing up India, but within India, partitioning is taking place by creating boundaries within. Those are far more dangerous than the boundaries without. So I think it's that internal process of ferreting out, dividing. It's a way of thinking. That is how partition has structured our thinking. And I think it needs to be, if we are to exercise the ghost of partition, we are going to have to accept that partition as a way of thinking is a problem. I often tell my students at the Fletcher School that insofar as partition as a form of political arrangements is meant to be a conflict management issue, it has made conflict resolution impossible. So as a modality of solving problems of this world, I think partition of India is paradigmatic. There's lots to learn from it. And the first thing is to also go beyond it, but let's actually face the realities. One of the great misconceptions is that this all happened because of religion. And I think that's one of the things we need to put to rest and understand that, yes, it was human bestiality let loose by political decisions, but which were about politics, which were about power sharing for the most part. And so, I mean, I would just conclude, and I mean, I'd much rather have an interactive session with all of you, and just conclude by saying that these silences that we have, they need to be identified. I mean, this is what we need to talk about, rather than let partition divide us, because that is exactly what has been happening. If we are to overcome this problem, we all need to, and I'm so glad to see youth here, younger people here. It's you who are going to take this forward. So I'll just stop here, James. I'm happy to talk more, but I think I'd really much rather hear you all and then chat with you.